But certainly a lot of the impediments identified also are relevant to the SME sector as well. When we talk about the lack of infrastructure, the state infrastructure, the cost of doing business.
So rather than just trying to control these businesses, chase the new entrepreneurs off the street, we have to be a lot more proactive.
Hello viewers, welcome to another edition of Business PNG. There has been a lot of talk recently about the empowerment of small to medium enterprises, particularly locally owned SMEs. The push to create protectionist policies and an incubation space for indigenous SMEs is still a topic of discussion, as this is seen as a dual strategy to create wealth while lowering unemployment in the country. Tonight, we have discussions on this matter by a panel of experts. Joining us on tonight's show is Paul Barker from the Institute of National Affairs, Annie Gangloff, President of the Papua New Guinea Business Council, as well as Madang-based businessman Alan Bird.
Good evening viewers, I'm Martin Namarong. Joining me tonight on a very special panel on Business PNG, we have Alan Bird, a visionary and small business operator, Annie Gangloff from Gangloff Consulting, and Paul Barker from the Institute of National Affairs. Tonight we'll be discussing small and medium enterprises in Papua New Guinea. As you're all aware, the discussion on SMEs is becoming a national issue and a lot of people have a lot to say. And joining me on this panel are experts who have opinions about different aspects of SMEs and who might inform all of us about what should or should not be done with regards to creation of SME policies in Papua New Guinea. I begin with you, Paul. The Institute of National Affairs has released a report recently, a survey on businesses in Papua New Guinea and the challenges they faced. Could you give us an overview of what you found from your survey and compare it perhaps with data coming from international organizations like the IFC and the World Bank?
Thanks, Martin. Yes, every 5 years the INA undertakes a survey. We call it the Private Sector Survey, a survey of businesses and impediments to investment and business activities. We also incidentally undertake a survey on the informal economy, and we have also undertaken surveys on agriculture and some of the impediments there.
I understand the report has been conducted for the past, I think, since 1997. And looking at the results, what have you consistently found?
Well, consistently, the major impediment to business and investment has been law and order. If you can't conduct your business because of crime, then it makes it impossible. If you can't get your goods to the market because of hold-ups and delays of that sort, then that's the major impediment. But following that, there is corruption. Corruption wasn't such a big problem 15, 20 years ago, but that has come in second place along with transport infrastructure. Again, if you can't get your goods to the market, or if you can't pick up your products, your inputs, then you're going to be out of business very quickly. So lifelines like the Highlands Highway, but ports, rural access roads, other transport infrastructure clearly comes out equal second in this year's survey, together with corruption. Behind that is electricity and other infrastructure. Telecommunications, that comes in close behind, but is slightly improved from since the arrival of competition in mobile phones. But we still know that the internet access is something like 10 times more costly and much narrower bandwidth than in most other countries that PNG has to compete in.
Annie, I guess from your perspective as someone who's engaged with major private sector partners, considering what Paul has said, what is the private sector view on some of these issues?
Well, certainly the key impediments still remain, and if anything, they tend to differ in terms of percentage priorities from one survey to another. But certainly a lot of the impediments identified also are relevant to the SME sector as well. When we talk about the lack of infrastructure, the state infrastructure, the cost of doing business, that still impacts on the SME sector as well. The inability for SMEs in the rural, particularly in the rural areas, to be able to sustain operations, the lack of electricity. We have farming where, fresh produce could be sold, chickens and freezer and what have you. Because of the lack of electricity, we can't sell it in the rural areas.
And Alan, I saw you nodding when Annie was talking about the challenges in remote areas. As a small business operator, what are some challenges that you face?
Well, you have to understand that I started my business operations essentially from a rural area and then moved out towards an urban setting. But leave that aside. You need certain minimum infrastructure if you are going to kind of move business out from the urban areas. Electricity being one, telecommunications, banks, all those sorts of institutions that help support it. But in addition to that, there was an interesting point that Paul made, which I thought is worth investigating further, and that's the crime issue. What we forget is that we have about maybe a 70% unemployment rate in PNG. No one really knows because the data is unclear, but you simply need to look under a tree walking around Port Moresby, Ley, or pick a city, pick a town, and you see so many young men sitting around doing nothing. That's the extent of the unemployment.
And Paul, I come back to you. The surveys showed that the number of employee theft too was an issue among some business when it regards to, I mean, I've saw figures like about, it costs some businesses on average about 80,000 per year just on stuff that's stolen by staff. And another issue that was highlighted was the retention of staff. So businesses face salaries problems with regards to retention. So what are your perspectives on this issue?
Well, also you have the issue that one of the significant impediments to business is the lack of access to skilled staff. So again, we're coming back to the issue of education and effective technical and vocational training, so as to enable people to move from that category of the unemployed to being immediately of high value to and demand to those businesses.
Now, Annie, just reflecting on what Paul has said, what is the industry or private sector experience of skills that they require in terms of the conduct of their business?
Certainly in terms of the private sector, a lot of the issues faced by employers is the inadequacy of training. Certainly the students that come out of university are ill-equipped to...
And I suppose there's a cost as well that business bear in terms of training their staff.
There is a cost. A lot of the larger employers are actually doing their own self-training in terms of employees, and when they do get trained, then they go off to work for other employers. But the cost of internal training is an expensive part of the overall cost of doing business.
Stay tuned. We continue our discussions when we come back. Foreign-owned businesses outnumber local businesses in PNG. This is a great concern that is echoed by local SMEs, urging the government to create protectionist policies for indigenous SMEs. In this segment, we hear from Alan Bird as he shares his experiences of setting up his business. We also hear of other challenges that aspiring PNG businessmen and women face in the country.
Alan, you had experience with the vanilla industry in the Pacific. Could you just give us a background on some of the difficulties that you faced when you were a vanilla buyer in the Pacific?
I guess the basic one is really finding a place to operate from. I started off in a settlement, and I had a one-bedroom office, if you like, with a fax and an internet line. I think a lot of Papua New Guineans start that way. But then there's other difficulties like trying to open a bank account, getting loans. Essentially, no one would lend me any money when I started off. And I think that's the same story with a lot of other Papua New Guineans, because we essentially are unbankable if you look at the standards of the banking industry, which is one of the reasons why at the SME Summit we're calling for some kind of an incubation scheme that will pick up Papua New Guineans who have an interest in going into business and kind of coach them along.
Now, Annie, what are your perspectives on in terms of the statement that has been made that Papua New Guineans are not bankable? You're obviously an independent Papua New Guinean consultant. I'm assuming, therefore, you're bankable. So in terms of that argument that Papua New Guineans are not bankable, is it justified?
Under the current rules, there are issues faced by Papua New Guineans wanting to go into business, and it comes on to what you mean by bankable. A lot of the issues that we face is in terms of what product we're trying to sell. The SME sector is a relatively unknown, but I think I agree with Alan, this whole process of incubation needs to be looked at. And if you go back since independence, we've had the Straight Price Install system, we've had the SPDC set up, we've had the Industrial Centres Development Corporation. We've had various models created to basically provide that incubation facilitation for SMEs.
And Paul, with regards to the survey that you've conducted, looking at the figures, have you seen an increase in the number of Papua New Guinean businesses that you, as a proportion of the survey that you've conducted, who've been involved in the survey? And just from the top of your head, if you can remember, is there any specific issue that those Papua New Guinean businesses face and they highlight in the survey?
Well, something like 60% of the respondents to the survey are Papua New Guinean owned businesses. But just in terms of the history, of course, if you went back well before the war, 1930s, in East New Britain, there were Tolai businessmen who were producing, who owned trucks and were actively involved in agricultural trading. Somehow the number of, and then after the war we had the cooperatives, somehow the number of businesses that should, and one would have expected Papua New Guineans to have owned since then, have not grown to the extent that one would expect, partly because, yes, there hasn't been effective extension in agriculture or in business. Very small number of Papua New Guineans have bank accounts. Until a few years ago, it was only 8%, one of the lowest rates of financial inclusion in the world. It's improved a little bit in the last few years, particularly with support from the central bank encouraging financial inclusion and with the opening up of all these microfinance institutions. But also, you have problems like banks want to see some sort of security, for example, land. And in PNG, it's very difficult, even in the formal land market.
Now I'll come back to you, Alan. You've highlighted some very critical stuff, and the issue of bankability is one of them. When you think of entrepreneurs, Papua New Guinea entrepreneurs, because not everybody is capable of running a business, let's face it, what are the requirements do you think, what requirements are needed in order to identify entrepreneurs and to incubate them? Because if we're going to, if you like, allocate a lot of the national resources on a government project, one has to identify people who are going to actually grow businesses as opposed to people who will be just wasting money.
Absolutely. There needs to be an equitable system that kind of judges everyone based on their own merits. The first yardstick would have to be equity, their own sweat equity. How much have they done with the limited resources they have, some kind of a track record in the industry that they want to participate in. I mean, you don't want to go and pick up someone who's a PMV driver wanting to run a medical practice sort of thing. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I'm just stating the obvious, I guess. And then things like, looking at their own personal approach to finances. Are they disciplined, I mean, if you're going to put government resources behind someone who's sitting at the pokies every night, that wouldn't be very wise. One of the things I've found is that Papua New Guineans are very smart, very talented people, but we lack discipline. And I speak as a Papua New Guinean. The difference between us and say, the mainland Chinese guy that's coming here to do business, of course, he said 2,000 years of history in business and we're just starting. That's one advantage he has. But the second advantage is that he's got staying power. He's able to sit there and watch the till from 6 in the morning till 8 at night. We can't do that because somebody dies down in Gerehu and you have to attend the house cry. So you leave the shop. These are just realities. And then somebody dies in the village or somebody dies in Mosby and you got to help pay for the coffin to go back and you're the businessman, businesswoman. Your entire tribe is looking at you to kind of take the lead in how to shift the body home and shift half the relatives and then shift them back again. So, even though socially our business individuals, men and women, play a role in keeping society together and in some of that, they also need to demonstrate some discipline in, just being able to say no.
Up next, costs involved in doing business and the PNG market. If you've just joined us, you're watching Business PNG. Starting a business involves risks. There are many costs involved, so careful decision making is required. Given that the PNG economy consists of a dominating informal sector, financial and business literacy is vital for the growth of the SME sector. Should the government place priority on enhancing financial and business literacy? Let's find out.
Annie, there are some issues that small businesses face that even large businesses face. You've highlighted electricity, infrastructure. Could you just give us an overview of where the issues actually merge and how government needs to address some of these issues?
Essentially comes down to the cost of doing business. A lot of the major businesses can absorb some of the additional sort of PNG type costs, costs that are borne by business in Papua New Guinea, and wouldn't find them elsewhere. Security, law and order related issues is one typical cost. The unfortunate thing is with the SME sector, that ability to absorb is limited, very limited. The other issue to understand is in Papua New Guinea, there's only about 15% of the population that actually work in terms of paying taxes. That 15% contributes about 30% of the national budget in terms of income tax. The development of SME is critical to not only broaden the amount of taxpayers within the country, but also to contribute towards government revenue for funding services. So the development of SMEs is critical, but the cost of operating an SME needs to be facilitated.
I suppose I go to the report that you put out, and in the report, if I can recall correctly, security costs for some businesses are about 6%. Some numbers that I saw in there were about 10,000 kina a month to pay for guards. So what other costs do you see out of your surveys, Paul?
Absolutely. As Ernie just highlighted, the costs vary between businesses of security. You've got the cost of hiring security guards, etc., but you also have the costs of crime itself, where you actually lose something, and there are different, obviously, threats to individuals as well as loss of property and so on. If you're a big mining corporation, crime can be a big problem, but you can, to some extent, ring fence your project. If you're a small to medium enterprise, particularly in some more vulnerable industries like tourism and hospitality, it's very much harder and more costly.
Alan, you've had experience running a business that, particularly with vanilla buying, and the security costs, I'm assuming, for transporting cash must have been very high. Could you give us some insights into that?
I was lucky, being a local and coming from one of the more aggressive tribal groups in the CPIC, that helped a lot. So I never had issues with holdups along the highway. But I think focusing on crime without looking at the root causes has been the failure of most governments. I mean, if you look at the development strategic plan, one of its number one objectives is to deal with law and order. I mean, what do? Do we get more policemen, give them more guns, give them more bullets? I mean, what are we talking about? We can either do that, or we can look for ways of creating opportunities for Papua New Guineans. You've only got two options. You either shoot them all, or you create opportunities for them, and then they begin to participate meaningfully, and they make a contribution. I mean, you look right now at all these trucks being stopped along the Highlands Highway, because they know there's an LNG project going on, and they're standing there watching these trucks roll by. They're thinking, well, I'm going to collect the tax, and that's essentially what they're doing. They're stopping the trucks, they're asking for ransoms, they're doing all those sorts of things, and you see all the truck operators arguing about it in the papers. The solution is to find ways to gainfully employ those people, provide them an opportunity to make an honest living. Then they're going to move away from what is opportunistic at the moment, I think.
One of the things that the minister has highlighted is that the market hasn't provided the ability for particularly Papua New Guineans to get involved in business. What was your experience in terms of the market facilitating entry into business?
The market is a harsh place. It's no place for softies. What we're arguing essentially, and certainly I am, is that you need to provide that space where more Papua New Guineans can get into business. If you leave it to chance, look, in the last, if you look at the policies of government over the last 30 years, there's been an interest in foreign direct investment. The idea being, if you get more foreign investment, more foreign companies coming here and putting their factories and whatnot, they're going to make money, and somehow that will then trickle down and other businesses will miraculously spring up based on the trickle-down theory. The trickle-down theory has not worked in Papua New Guinea. What it's done is it's created two different classes. You've got the formal economy and an extremely large informal economy.
And Annie, you've mentioned something, and that is the requirements that are needed for identifying the requirements with regards to the SME policy and those entrepreneurs who might get government assistance. One of the things, I suppose, is the issue of sustainability, and we've highlighted the impediments to doing business. And what is your view about the possibility that those who might be assisted by government would be able to own and run sustainable businesses?
One of the biggest challenges is, not everybody is cut out to be a businessman. Some of the prerequisites, you've got to want to know about the business. You've got to want to be in business. Ellen talked about the truck driver running a medical practice, a classic example. The desire's got to be there. You've got to have some skills to be able to run that business effectively. It comes back to being bankable. I'm an accountant. I can do an accounting business. So if I went to a bank and said, I want to do this, I don't have an issue. If I went and said, look, I want to run a shipping lane, then that's a different story. So they're the impediments that needs to be addressed. But it's about providing that incubation that we touched on earlier. The government, in terms of policy, doesn't need to just say, this is what we can do. It's about saying, what do the people want to do?
When we come back, the possible way forward for local SMEs. Stay with us. Welcome back. As the resource sector booms in the country, business opportunities continue to grow. This poses a huge challenge for government decisions on the SME sector. The panel members present suggestions to the government on the areas in the SME sector that need to be addressed.
Alan, you were involved in the policy making, the draft of the Medang communique. What do you think is the way forward for SMEs in the country?
I wasn't involved in the formulation. I was away doing other things after my presentation. But in any case, I think there are two critical aspects to look at. One is this incubation that we keep talking about. That's critical. Number two is some sort of a risk guarantee facility. If you look at the Australian experience, for instance, up to 3 out of 4 of new startups in businesses fail. Now, the Australians have accepted that that is an acceptable failure rate. In PNG, state needs to sort of come to the party understanding that there will be a lot of failures, but it has to agree that those failures are acceptable. Because the banks won't take the risk for understandable reasons, they're in it to make a profit. The government is not here to make a profit. The government is here for the long haul. So it needs to take risks in areas where others are not willing to. Because if the state does not take the risk in trying to build this SME segment we are talking about, then who's going to do it?
Annie, who's going to do it? What's the way forward, and how do we get government buy-in into everything that's happening?
Well, the government's got to certainly take responsibility. I think it starts and stops with government. The ability to start the business and run the business is with the citizens of Papua New Guinea, but they will need help. We're banking on a system that isn't local. It's a foreign banking system. They have requirements to be in business, and that middle mark is the government. The question that I pose to government is how are they actually going about addressing that enabler?
And Paul, you crunch a lot of numbers. You've seen the risks with the recent survey. We're going to be putting a lot of money into, if the government comes up with a policy and a mechanism for delivering, there's going to be a lot of public money put into a very risky adventure, if you like. So from your perspective and your analysis of the data that exists and the risks that are involved, is it a wise way of allocating public funds going forward?
Certainly supporting the SMEs is a very valuable commitment, but it is critical that it is based on what the real constraints what to those SMEs actually are. That one doesn't just pump money in just willy-nilly. I'd slightly differ with Alan on the comment that there's a big difference between the large and formal sector and the small SMEs. Yes, there are substantial differences, but largely the interests of businesses are shared. Most of the interests of businesses are shared about having suitable law and order conditions, corrupt-free, having the infrastructure in place, and a competitive environment. Most conditions, and then some aspects are actually shared in a different way. Larger businesses can help train people who then become able to use their skills in their own businesses. Similarly, there are, for example, agro-nucleus enterprises where a large business works with and supports smaller businesses, whether in tourism or in agriculture or in other areas. At the moment, we have an informal economy which tends to be people selling betel nuts or selling food on the street corners, and they tend to get chased off if they're in the wrong place. We need to give people the suitable venues, not just fresh market produce markets, but places where small businesses can operate, small manufacturers can operate, and also can get skills support and a range of other products. So rather than just trying to control these businesses, chase the new entrepreneurs off the street, we have to be a lot more proactive. Some urban authorities in Papua New Guinea are more supportive to micro enterprises than others. But as I say, to become a large business person, you normally have to be a small micro enterprise, whether you're a woman or a man. And we also know that there needs to be special consideration of women in business. And we know that often women are some of the best managers of money. A lot of surveys have demonstrated that they manage money often better than men, but they often don't have an opportunity to develop businesses for a number of reasons. So giving some sort of special consideration for the needs of women in businesses is also critical.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Business PNG tonight.
And that winds up this edition of Business PNG. To access our programs online, log on to www.mtv.com.pg. Also, remember to send us your feedback via Facebook or email. Until then, I'm Dennis Orere. Bye for now.